Am I up and going? Can I try again? Is that me? Can I... Knock, knock. Hello. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I've tried to just wait for it to become a trickle and then a stop through the door, and I think we're at the trickle, if not the stop, so we might get underway. Thank you very much. If you've made a mistake, it's too late. You can't leave the room. Of course, lots of challenges following up that presentation. Obviously, I just want to sit in a ball and hear other people speak and not speak anymore, because our keynote address was wonderful and very challenging in lots of ways, and it's hard for me to now stand up and talk about decolonisation. I don't actually want to, if anybody else wants the microphone. We've got an hour and 15 minutes. We've now got an hour and 5 minutes. Every minute I spend rambling compromises the time for the Q&A at the end, so I'm just going to get stuck in. 3 speakers this morning. The first will be Caitlin Finlayson, pointing right there, currently a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, a social scientist who was embedded in Oxfam Aotearoa for a number of years. We'll be talking about her experience there and the efforts that OA have gone to transition and change some of their practices and approaches. We're also joined by Erin Thomas, who is a recent graduate, I think, of the master's program here at UOA, and nowadays an employee of ICAD, an INGO that we're going to learn a bit more about this afternoon. And then there's me. My name's Glenn, and I have a background working for big INGOs. So I described myself earlier today as an INGO floozy, spent time with Save the Children, spent time with Plan International, spent time with Care International. Those last two don't really have a presence in New Zealand, but they're big international NGOs. More recently, I provide consulting advice to INGOs and do a bit of academic stuff as well. More about that academic stuff later. I'm going to get us underway with Caitlin. So I'm going to talk a little about our session. Sorry, I'm really unsettled after Uma. What we're here to talk about is the legitimacy gap for international NGOs. So that's a long conversation in itself, whether that's an appropriate way of describing it, but there's no doubting that international NGOs and their place in the world is being questioned and being challenged in ways that it perhaps never has. There are long-standing questions about legitimacy for international NGOs, the role they play in the world, their representative or unrepresentative status, their self-interest over their practices, a whole bunch of criticisms and concerns and support and engagement and endorsement, a real balance over the years. But more recently, that conversation has sharpened, particularly in the context of this decolonisation conversation that is not new. We just saw some quotes from Said in 1978, but is certainly has certainly sharpened in the last couple of years. I'm having a conversation at the moment with a large Australian NGO working through some of this content for their forward planning, and I tried to talk about the changing discourse and shared a few of the documents just in the last 18 months that have been produced around INGOs and decolonisation, and just throwing up bond reports and ODI reports and a whole lot of Peace Direct reports and northern ones, southern ones, west and east. There is so much happening so quickly in this space that trying to catch up for INGOs is proving perhaps more challenging than it has in the past, and it's always been challenging. So we want to look at 3 different elements today in our presentations. So we'll hear 3 quite different stories, but within that we want to talk about what INGOs are currently doing to unpack power relations through partnership practice and structural reform. We're also going to talk about some examples where we see them of power being wielded and yielded, and trying to touch on that question of whether or not everybody has a shared interest in ceding power with international NGOs, which is a large question. And finally, whether reform in any form can actually address the legitimacy gap for Northern, a flawed term, I accept, but for international NGOs in a time of decolonisation. So one of the questions Professor Kothari asked just moments ago was whether or not development as we know it can exist, can resonate beyond a time, beyond decolonisation. I can't remember the exact, is it tenable, I think was the language in the previous session, which, you know, and within that, what role are INGOs? INGOs are increasingly seen as complicit in the structural inequities that the aid system perpetuates. So that's challenging. It's a challenging time to be part of an INGO, wherever your position in that structure. People in the developing countries where INGOs work are faced with criticisms and challenges for their association with international organisations in new and different ways. Obviously, people in the global north are facing all sorts of existential crises, having come to this work with notions of global citizenship and solidarity, and being presented with a reality that suggests that some of us are actually part of something far more seedy. So let's hear about it from the floor. Caitlin, maybe you can get us going.
So, kia ora Glenn, and tēnā koe, ko Caitlin, toko ingoa. Just as an aside, as you were speaking, Glenn, I was just thinking from Uma's speech that one of my podcasts on my list that I listen to is called Stuff the British Stole, and if you haven't heard of it, it's a really, and it's done by this Australian comedian. And it's a really interesting podcast looking at exactly some of the materiality and of colonisation. Anyway, that was an aside. I just wanted to say that. So yeah, as Glenn mentioned today, I'm going to speak about my experience at Oxfam Aotearoa. But before I do that, I just want to place myself in that context. So I'm an Australian woman. I'm also an Irish woman. I was born in Australia on unceded Wurundjeri land. But I now, born to an Irish father and an Australian mother. But I now am making my home in Te Mamaku, in Te Tau Ihu, so the beautiful top of the South Island. So as Glenn mentioned as well, I'm a social scientist. My background is in sociology, and I'm currently working as a research fellow at the University of Melbourne. But today I'm going to talk to you about my PhD research, which I undertook with La Trobe University, the Institute for Human Security and Social Change, and this took place from 2016 to 2021. Could we go to the next slide? Thanks, Connor. So, like my fellow panellists, I was also interested in the reforms which were taking place within international NGOs, and a little bit referring to a fantastic session this morning, 1.2. I was more interested not so much in what was happening over there, but what was happening here in the kind of global north or majority kind of world. So a little bit of the background to my research was exactly what Glenn was referring to earlier, that, you know, international NGOs have been both praised and criticised for their work in the development sector, but since the 1990s, this increased scrutiny and debate had really increased. Which had resulted in calls for change about their work and the way that they undertake it, both from practitioners and from academics. So they faced a number of challenges in a contemporary context of change and uncertainty, and I think this is still the case. I'm kind of going a little bit back to my 2016 when I started my research, and some of the things I identified was that there was a disconnect with their ethical foundations. They had very restrictive business models, and there was a lot of complexities around the nature of social change. And as I said, I think that those kind of problems are still present today, 5 years on. So given this reality, many leading international NGOs, when I started my work, were looking to better understand and transform their development practices so that they could remain relevant and impact change in the future. So how they could transform themselves to achieve this and enable themselves to engage well with the challenges they face. This was the research question that I addressed. And I focused just on one international NGO, which at the time was Oxfam New Zealand, and they have now changed the name of the organisation to Oxfam Aotearoa. So my data collection took place over 20 months. This was 2017 to 2019. So just to acknowledge that that was a pre-pandemic time, and also to say that I guess there's been a lot of things that have no doubt changed in the organisation since then, and it's really nice to hear about some of those changes here at this conference, connecting to people from the organisation who are still there. The next slide, please. So I'll spend the majority of my time on this slide, and I just want to speak to 3 examples from my research, which hopefully will contribute something to the discussion today. So in my research, I frame legitimacy gaps as engaging well, and so I lean in my work on community economy scholarship and this concept of surviving well, or what also can be termed as engaging well. In my research, I also used the scholarship of Shelley Spiller and wayfinding leadership to try and understand the journey that Oxfam was on. So engaging well is not an end state. It's very much active and ongoing work of creating and maintaining the conditions of possibility for engaging well. So key to this and transformation for me, I guess in very simple terms, it's not just changing what we do, but it's how we do it. And as I said, I'm going to talk to just 3 examples from Oxfam's journey and their journey to engage well. So the first example, in my research, I talk about their journey that they went on to engage with Te Ao Māori. And this speaks a lot to, again, the session this morning, this idea, and I was interested in it as well, that first we have to start where we are. So in the research, I talk about 4 specific practices that were ongoing in the organisation: rituals, metaphors, use of Te Reo Māori language, and also self-reflection group activities that they undertook on power and privilege. So alongside these practices, there were also changes going on in the organisation amongst the board with more Pacific and Māori representation. There was engagement and time by staff spent on marae. So all of the culmination of these practices and work led, as I mentioned earlier, to the organisation taking a public action to change the name. So that happened in 2020 in December, and that was a year after I finished my fieldwork. So it was really interesting to see where they sort of went to after I left the organisation. And I guess a couple of things just to reflect on that is the power of time. Also that it was very much, the steps that they took were very much emergent and almost a kind of organic process. There wasn't any official strategic kind of plans to do this work, and they were, but there were sort of key individuals in the organisation at the time who were leading these practices. Obviously, there was a lot of influence from the board to give these practices a legitimacy. And importantly, these practices provided a place-based and identity narrative from which the leadership team and staff could reframe their thinking about how to transform their development practices. And to me, it highlighted a recognition of the power with, and a recognition that we can learn from and transform ourselves through opening up space to different knowledges. The second example, and I am going through these quite quickly, but I'm happy to talk about them more later on. The second example I wanted to talk about today was the development of a new partnership strategy that took place when I was at the organisation. So I spend a chapter in my thesis talking about this work, and this strategy was developed in response to what was called Oxfam 2020, and this was a confederation-wide localization process. But also at the time there was an organisational restructure within Oxfam, which had occurred in 2016. And there was also an interest by the staff within the Partnerships Director about the need to look for alternative ways to implement their development practice, which were outside of the project management and transactional contract models. So there was an intention to shift from more of a power over model to a power with. And so a few points to kind of note about that process. The strategy was influenced and developed by external ideas, and again linking to the first set of practices, another kind of engagement with Te Ao Māori. They also gathered staff input, went through reflexive sessions together, and they also linked it to their organisational values. So it was a values-based process. But there were challenges in this process as well. It was difficult for the Partnerships Directorate to get the strategy accepted by the leadership team and the board. It was quite a departure from what they'd done before. And then they had to go on a journey of understanding and coming to terms with actually the practicalities of implementing the strategy. They were also, so through this process, they were trying to change relationships between Oxfam New Zealand and Oxfam country and regional offices in the Pacific. There were opportunities there to sort of revise the nature of these relationships, also their relationship with MFAT at the time, which there was in 2017, that was post the election of a new government. So a lot of wielding and yielding power there, and the whole point of Oxfam 2020 was about yielding power to the Global South. And I think as well, I want to highlight that process was a lot about ceding power, but also a lot about uncertainty, which was interesting in the organisation to see how they dealt with that. A lot of questions about what are we going to do if we're not directly managing projects? How do we ensure that country officers are being heard in this transition? So some of the sort of insights into the power dynamics going on there. I think what this process highlighted, though, that it was an attempt to propose a new narrative about development practices which centred on developing partnerships, which relied on strong and inclusive relationships. And it highlighted to me the sort of complexity of not only building new types of partnerships, but also the difficulties faced by staff and the leadership team in balancing the requirements of these sort of transactional models with new relational typologies. Quickly just mention the third example, which when I was preparing this presentation, I thought actually is another kind of interesting take on looking at legitimacy and power. When I was at the organisation, there was cases that came up in the media, this was February 2018, of cases of sexual misconduct and abuse by Oxfam, not Oxfam New Zealand staff, but Oxfam Great Britain staff. There's maybe some people in the room who remember that. And this was really highly significant for the Oxfam Confederation and in turn for Oxfam New Zealand. And responding to this took precedence over all other everyday work and activity at the time, and I didn't plan, actually, two of these examples I didn't plan to write about at all, but they were so significant. And this one particularly, I wanted to mention it because it kind of touched on that, at the time, what felt like an issue of organisational survival. And what became apparent was a practice internally in the organisation. They attempted to respond to this in what I framed as a values-based response. And this was not an easy thing to do. So it meant for them that they had to grapple with, there was quite a lot of emotional impacts on staff within the organisation in response to these cases. It meant taking public responsibility. It meant recognizing that there were no easy answers. And so that was the sort of internal response, and then externally as well, they had to be very open and transparent in the public debate and demonstrate remorse and a commitment to positive action. And certainly at the time, like I said, it was quite an intense issue. There was a sort of mixed response from supporters. Some supporters decided to cease their donations to the organisation, and then on the flip side, other supporters actually decided to increase their donations. There was also a freeze on funding for projects in any way which were connected to Oxfam Great Britain. So it really caused the leadership team and staff to undertake reflective thinking about what was core and foundational to their organisational identity and what should guide their development practices. Thanks, Connor. We can go to the last slide. So just summing up for me, I guess, to respond to one of our questions for our discussion today was, can reform in any form address the legitimacy gaps for Northern NGOs in a time of decolonisation? I think it's a journey, and the approach that I took to looking at Oxfam and their story was trying to look at the strengths of their journey and what engaging well looks like. There are certainly steps that can be taken, the 3 points to summarise from my research were that their journey of engaging well involved strongly connecting to place. It involved developing organisational values which were meaningful, and it involved undertaking a change process that was imbued with their values, but that was also quite emergent and open-ended. And I will leave it there. Thank you all.
It's Erin's turn. Let's just click.
Easy. Oh, there it is. Kia ora tātou, everyone. It's great to be here with you all. Yes, as Glenn mentioned, I'm an alum of the University of Auckland Development Studies program, so it's a real pleasure to be here today. But now I'm here with you all as a practitioner. So my name is Erin Thomas. I am the Policy and Research Coordinator at ICAD, which is the International Center for Advocates Against Discrimination. We sound very impressive. That's because we are US-based and we sort of have that audacity. But you will come to see that we have a bit of a more humble approach to how we do our work. So what I aim to do today is explain a little bit about ICAD and what we do, provide a little bit of a framework around how we might think about international advocacy NGO accountability and structure, talk about some project examples to give us some food for critique, I should say, and then come back to the bigger picture of these really rich questions that we started the session with. So to start us off, our theory of change, we are a human rights advocacy center, and our goal is to create innovative solutions that disrupt unjust systems to ensure a more equitable future. How broad. In our actual work, we are able to work in quite a relationships-driven way, which I'll talk about in some of the project examples, but we're also uniquely positioned to leverage pro bono resources from law and technology firms, which make us a little bit unique in the INGO space. And what this looks like is a range of capacity building, advocacy, education, research, and artivism programming that are driven by our relationships and broadly fall under the mandate of international human rights law. Now, just to clarify, we are an advocacy organization, and that does overlap, obviously, a lot in the development sector, but we are squarely in the human rights advocacy space. Now, that being said, we have a very small team. This is our humble side. There are 5 full-time staff members with a 4-person board of directors and a wide network of advisors who participate in our work on a volunteer and paid consulting basis. We are registered in the US, but as I'll share in a minute, we have a lot of Pacific programs, so it's handy to have me here based in Tamaki Makaurau. Now, we're able to operate with a very iterative and relationship-driven approach, partly due to our practice of building relationships and investing our operational budget in developing pilots for projects before seeking grant funding. Now, some of you might call that flying by the seat of your pants, but we call it business as usual, for better and for worse. And I'm not going to attempt to click this link, but for full transparency, and what I think is important when we talk about INGOs is some of the more nitty-gritty of how we operate. So just to give you some context, our revenue for this year is $300,000 US. We get a mix of foundation grants, individual donors, consulting grants, and government grants. That varies year to year. And we're also able to leverage a lot of pro bono support. So able to make really big projects because we're able to leverage thousands of hours of pro bono from law firms and technology firms. Now, to give us a little bit more background and a framework on different types of accountability and structures used by international advocacy NGOs, I'll just provide this brief overview from LD Brown and their colleagues. And this exploration actually helped us as an organization to develop intentionally and to sort of learn from some of the gaps and shortcomings in this space. Now, I won't go into depth on each of these, but I'll just touch on each one and explain sort of where ICAD falls, because it's a little bit difficult sometimes to explain what we do. So we thought about this in terms of our accountability as an organization, which is important when it comes to power and legitimacy, as well as the structure that we might choose to use. So constituency-based is something we might think about a direct focus on constituents that an organization works with. Movement-based accountability emphasizes more common values in the pursuit of public goods. And mission-based accountability would focus more on the expected interests of constituents and broader movements, perhaps being a little bit further disconnected from actual constituents. Now, in terms of structure, we see unitary organizations, for example, international service organizations like Plan International, federations, which might have a stronger centralized coordinating unit of affiliates. We have confederations, which Oxfam Aotearoa is a great example of, and the Oxfam brand internationally. Networks, which tend to have a bit more autonomy for their affiliates, and support organizations, which have the greatest degree of autonomy among affiliate NGOs, and play more of a role in providing technical assistance to those NGOs in their network. Now, given this framework, we think about ICAD as a support organization with a high degree of technical expertise internally and with our pro bono partnerships. So we pull together a loosely coupled network of autonomous local NGOs, which is a little bit too humble if you all are familiar with some of the local NGOs we work with, all sort of under the mandate of combating structural discrimination in their own jurisdictions. Now, as such, we don't have in-country offices. In fact, we're entirely remote, and we do that intentionally, which I'll get to in a minute. But in terms of accountability, we are largely movement-based in the sense that our accountability in a practical sense lies in our partnerships with local organizations. And this is often how our grant funding is set up as well. And at the same time, our mission is grounded in international human rights law, which guides generally who we partner with, and at times we also work directly with constituents. So as a social scientist, it's never either or, we're a bit of everything. Now, before I get into some examples that will allow us to critique our model based on our discussion of power and legitimacy, I just want to frame some of the conversations that we have about these topics as an organization. Now, in terms of power relations in the sector broadly, we don't have an international reputation. Has anyone heard of ICAD before? No? Oh, well, a couple of you, because I know you. So we don't have offices in the countries that we work in, and this is intentional, right? It puts us in a unique situation where we have very low overhead, and we actually have to work in a relationship-driven way, and we have to share power more often than not to accomplish anything. Now, because we lack the more formal legitimacy of larger, more established organizations, often we're only able to work in any given place through the enabling power of local NGOs. Well, there are many ways that this can be manipulated, surely, given the legacy infrastructure that we'll talk about. More often than not, it actually keeps us in check, which we'll talk about with some examples. But to answer this question of is there a common interest in sharing power, my answer to that would be yes and no, and it depends who you ask. For the yes answer, as I explained, as an organization, our aspiration is to measure our success internally by the strength of our relationships with local NGOs. In practice, this looks like success might be rigorous collaboration, major pro bono outputs with significant local impacts, or notoriety for our local NGO partners. On the other hand, our survival as an organization, which we've talked about, depends on us explaining what we do and our role as a uniquely positioned support organization that often doesn't tick the boxes required by the sector at times. Now, sometimes this leads to not necessarily our interest shifting to hoarding power, but perhaps rather losing the focus on yielding power when we consider sort of our needs for funding and surviving as an organization. And the competitive nature of the nonprofit industrial complex certainly makes this particularly challenging. Now, another example of this is our board of directors. Our board could play a very important role in representing movement interests and principles and holding us accountable, which you might hear in my tone that was my perspective on what our board should be doing. But however, like many other nonprofits, our board's priorities are particularly around fundraising, which is pretty standard when it comes to INGOs. Now, I'm just going to run through some quick examples of our projects that will hopefully spark some questions and critique. So to start, TrackGBV is one of our longest-standing programs, which is focused on judicial bias in the sentencing of gender-based violence cases. It emerged in our relationship with the Fiji women's rights movement, who identified the sentencing of cases as a site of gender discrimination. So since then, that was 2013, we've leveraged our pro bono resources via thousands of hours of lawyers manually reviewing cases based on the methodology we built together with FWRM to create a publicly available dashboard that tells a powerful story to back the interests of local advocates. Now, we've also been able to use the legitimacy of our pro bono law firm partners and lawyers on our team and advisory to engage directly with judiciaries, which has also had the effect of legitimizing the efforts of local advocates. So imagine some American lawyers showing up in suits saying the exact same thing that the FWR advocates might be saying to the Chief Justice of Fiji, which is something that has actually happened. Another example falls under our Right to Life with Dignity program, which is aimed at expanding legal protections for climate-induced migrants. Now, one relationship that grew out of this project was with a local advocate on Rambi in Fiji. Some of you might have heard parts of this story in Kati's presentation this morning. But for some context, the displacement of Bonobans from Banaba to Rambi tells a crucial story of what not to do moving forward, especially in terms of legal protections around the right of return, for example, to Banaba in present-day Kiribati, and other concerns around citizenship rights. So this project began with the Rambi Local Council running a series of community dialogue sessions to generate legal questions for our law firm partner to answer, which they did in depth. They produced a comprehensive legal memo featuring hours and hours of very, very expensive legal work that we all got for free. And we were able to share that out on Rambi and are now moving forward to collaboratively build a citizenship handbook based on some of those concerns. We've also been able to play a role in preliminary discussions and introductions to other development partners in Fiji and the region in response to the way Rambi has fallen through the cracks in terms of human rights protections and development assistance, in essence, using our power to make critical connections. Now, the final example I will walk through is our nuclear justice work in the Marshall Islands. We were brought on to support the Marshall Islands National Nuclear Commission to do legal research and capacity building to support negotiations with the US. Now, our support in many ways has legitimized claims for reparations from the US, but I won't be able to touch on too much of that because the negotiations are ongoing, and while that sounds very sneaky, I actually don't know what's going on. But one thing that we were able to do, which I'll just share here, is digitize and make searchable a database of all of the US declassified documents on the nuclear testing program. So the US government had only delivered 2 sets of hard copies, one to Majuro in the Marshall Islands and one to the embassy in the US, and they were just stacks of documents that you could not find anything in. So in 2020, and that was 1994 when they were delivered, in 2020 we were able to use optical character recognition with an artificial intelligence advisor of ours, which is something that you just have, to make this set of over 13,000 documents searchable for advocates and negotiators alike. And there's some other stuff in here. But what I'll close with is just coming back to these big questions of power and legitimacy. I think in my perhaps fresh experience in this space, I'm quite hopeful about the work that we're able to do, and certainly we have a lot of room to grow, but really happy to be a part of networks where we can critique our approach. I think a few things that I've learned and that I'd like to share with other NGOs is that you can actually work in a relationship-driven way. And we're quite lucky to be so small and to be able to work on more or less a shoestring budget. But when you're able to do that and actually let local partners drive the shape of the project, it actually becomes quite clear how NGOs can play a role in decolonization, not doing the decolonization work, but leveraging our power where that's possible. And part of that is being really clear on where and when we're in the right place to help. We've been in a few different spots where local advocates sort of take a lot of flack from different places in the countries that they work in, and sometimes we actually see a strategic position for us to actually just legitimize them. I'm not replacing their work in any way, but saying, look at this badass advocate, like we need to celebrate them and back what they're doing. And the last thing, I want to make sure that this conversation is material, sort of coming back to Uma's keynote. Sharing resources and support and giving actual money and actual grant funding to local NGOs is key, and perhaps goes without saying. Most of our grants are actually set up in a joint way that keep us accountable to that, but obviously there's a lot more conversation that happens in putting all of that together. But we're also able to do that because we don't have in-country offices, we have low overhead, and we're able to sort of stay scrappy and stay in our lane. And those would be my key takeaways, but really looking forward to the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Erin. My turn. So I'm going to dazzle you with a couple of really dodgy smart art images over the first two slides. I presented on my work as a work in progress at DevNet in 2020, so apologies if there's some repetition, especially early in this presentation. It was a work in progress then, it's behind me now. I see, dazzling. Woo, how does he do it? I worked alongside with Care International. I was embedded in Care International. I was formerly a country director for Care in Southeast Asia, and after moving to New Zealand, I was engaged by Care to accompany the transition of 4 former country officers into local organisations as part of a big international commitment to localisation. I did that in a consulting capacity at mates rates, by the way. If it came up today about how expensive consultants are. But I also turned that, I was looking at INGO legitimacy and issues associated with that anyway with an academic hat on, and turned that into a PhD. So I too did that through La Trobe, the Institute for Human Security and Social Change, also like Caitlin with Chris Roche as my primary supervisor, so some of you will know Chris's work. So it's both a story from practice and a story from academia, like pretty much everything I have to share today. So broadly speaking, thinking about the idea of legitimacy and the role of international NGOs, the role of international development cooperation in the modern era, shrinking that down to a look at localisation and the conversations about what localisation looks like, and not just in the humanitarian space but in the long-term development space, shrinking that even further into the issue of localisation and legitimacy for international NGOs, the area that I had the most expertise and interest in, and then within that a specific example to get my teeth into around Care International's efforts in that space. So number 2, equally impressive. Smart art helps me here with a really simple description of something that is anything but simple. Complex adaptive systems was a conceptual framework that I used. Someone asked me a question about it this morning, and I felt a little embarrassed because it was one of those things that it was a lens, and it was really helpful and constructive early on. It didn't feature quite in the same way throughout the journey, but it's a really good way of looking at organisational change, particularly the layers of relationships and systems and how they affect change, levers and tipping points and those sorts of things. So I came back to that as a conceptual framework. Don't want to linger too much on this, but what my question was around the transition of an INGO country office and whether that positioned that new local organisation or indeed the international organisation for greater legitimacy, and a couple of sub-questions about what forces constrain or enable the realisation of legitimacy for INGOs and what other purposes INGO localisation might serve. So I collected a whole bunch of data over the course of several years, baseline exercises in 4 countries for care, 2 of which were part of the case study for the PhD. So it was Morocco, Egypt, Sri Lanka and Indonesia that I worked in. The 2 Asian countries, Sri Lanka and Indonesia, were the case study for the PhD. I then had a broad consultation the following year with a whole bunch of international voices, not just from across the Care International Confederation, but also from outside experts, from academia, from other NGOs, from elsewhere. No artificial intelligence advisors in that case, but I wish I had. Then another round of annual reflections in 2019 in all of those settings, another round of international voices in 2020, and another round of annual reflections. All of that was compromised, obviously, by COVID and the methodology changed, but I'm not going to bore you with Pivot. And then a consolidation and validation in 2021. So let's get to it. Along the way, I got stuck into a lot of different literature, some of which you'll be familiar with. Initially around localisation and civil society, the very notion of localisation, it's a description of whether it's an endpoint or whether is it a verb, is it something that is done to people, or is something that happens organically, for whom and by whom. Some of those big questions raised and discussed at length in the keynote just before this session, and particularly within that, the relationship between the global north and the global south. And I know, again, a flawed term, but it's the language that is used in a lot of the literature and resonated, or at least was easily understood within the care example. I also got into some detail about INGO form and function. So we heard from Erin about those models: confederation, federation, unitary model, leadership, central leadership and others. So that's really quite important in the way that INGOs behave, but also their ability or inability to change. So I got stuck into that and some other stuff around it. The tendency towards isomorphic mimicry and trying to replicate systems and do things in the way that they've always been done, and to reward systems that look like your systems. So if you're funding a local NGO, then you want an NGO that has exactly the same language and style and job descriptions as you have. Those sorts of challenges that have been part of the INGO history. Some stuff around accountability, particularly as inclusion and transparency in the exercise of power, how I chose to define it, because obviously accountability is a whole can of worms. Legitimacy, defined for the purposes of this work as the perceived right to exercise power. More about polarity and proximity in time. More about complex systems, as I've described them, and power. Power both as the capacity to effect change and as resistance to change. So that's all the stuff that I was reading and chewing over and mulling over the course of the accompaniment of care on their journey. I want to linger a bit on some of the findings. This is trying to consolidate a whole lot of work and a whole lot of thinking and a whole lot of effort from many people beyond myself. I think one of the most fundamental things coming out of the research was the importance of motivations around localisation and legitimacy. So a multiplicity of motivations. So people get on board within INGOs to the language for one reason or another. They're drawn to this because they think, maybe they think that it's going to make that organisation more competitive. Maybe they think the localisation is going to mean that they're more efficient and save some money. Maybe they think that it's actually the right thing to do. So maybe they are motivated by efficiency and effectiveness, so sort of instrumental values, or maybe they're normative values like social justice and change and equality. And those two things are simultaneously present in INGOs, and I don't think it's just care, around this conversation across the organisation. And that, in principle, would be fine as long as the high point, the end point is the same. You know, people can have different motivations, but what I found in practice is that those diverse and occasionally contradictory motivations around localisation are problematic. They mean that people reward different things on the journey towards change, and people are seeking different change, and people are seeking different evidence of change. And so if your desire is for greater efficiency, and a really successful transition program actually is leading to inefficiency, perhaps only in the short term, perhaps even in the long term, but is actually creating organisational change, what's the appetite for that? Is that a success story or is that a failure? So some really interesting content in there around motivations and multiplicity of motivations in particular. Some stuff around accountability, which was particularly interesting, most notably a disconnect between to my experience with care or accompanying care, but a disconnect between values and practices. So a real ability for people within INGOs, and I've been doing it for years and I've been one of those persons, is very, very challenging personal realisation, existential crisis going through research of this, where you can say why things should be in a particular way and in the same breath explain why you can't possibly do it that way in this particular set of circumstances. And the INGO world is littered with those examples where philosophically we'd like to do it this way, but in practice we're going to have to do it this way. And so that's really interesting when it comes to something that is about organisational values, and especially when you're espousing values of self-determination and devolved power. So within that, who owns the process? If this is a process about localisation, is that owned by a board or is that owned by the organisation entity being localised? Is it even possible to localise something? If you'll forgive me indulging that particular narrative. And not most importantly, but right up there, and this is not new to anyone who's been walking around INGOs for a while, but who judges the North? So the effectiveness, the efficiency, the quality of change, how well people are doing, how badly people are doing, how much risk there is, how much appetite there is for more risk or otherwise. It's all about the emerging local entities in this example. It's not about the Northern Arms. So in a confederation like CARE, lots of rich northern neighbours, parts of a big organisation, all with vested interests, all ready in their own way to judge a process that's happening underneath them or that they're a part of, but who is judging the North? Now, I may not be invited back to CARE after saying it so bluntly, but pros and cons. Civil society positioning. So this whole conversation about where INGOs fit within civil society, that is not a new one. That is not one I'm going to try and resolve today, but uncertainties at every level of the organisation about how that relationship should or could work in partnership with local civil society. Are you replicating? Are you an ally? Are you in solidarity? Are you in competition? And uncertainties prevailing at all levels about that, about what that position should be, whether it's about, you know, some old language of strengthening and capacity building and that's what we do and that's the value we add, or whether that is actually part of being complicit in the structural inequities that we seek to change through localisation. So some content in there as well. Local legitimacy versus global legitimacy. You're doing that to me? Nearly. Okay, so big changes in terms of, so for the local organisation emerging from the former country office, some real interesting insights and not uniformly, but some real progress and claims around greater local legitimacy, much less clear and certain at the international level about whether their efforts to support and embrace that sort of change led to any meaningful change in the way they were perceived, their perceived right to exercise power, particularly at a time when this decolonisation conversation is running free. The bestest and most wonderful examples of power changing through this example were power claimed rather than ceded. So this notion that here's some power, you should do with it as you please, flawed, we'll get back to that, but where opportunities were taken, claimed, so an organisation emerged out of CARE called the Global South Leaders Forum. So all of the CEOs and board chairs and potential leaders and other leaders from across the global civil society, Global South representation within the CARE International Confederation got together and bandied and came up with some ideas, and they were really, really quite powerful and instructive in terms of fundamentally shifting the organisation. So they produced something I was lucky enough to witness called the Cairo Compact in 2018, and then something called the Jakarta Communique in 2020, where they fundamentally instructed the organisation to start behaving differently in a series of ways that led directly to structural changes within the organisation, including their 2030 strategy, which now has an entirely different approach to the way the language of partnership is written. So really quite powerful shift, inspired in part by the international commitment to do some of this work and to elevate the voices of those local new emerging entities. Radical progress by CARE standards, I think by INGO standards in that space. Less so in the other way, power over care, absolutely power under care, pockets of amazing change, some really good examples of selfless contributions to the greater good, so to those normative values of change within the organisation, but for the most part prevailing hierarchies and entrenched behaviours, particularly even if a leader from the global north was espousing great change in a fundamentally different organisation, the processes and practices within were really slow to change. I have all of that stuff still to talk about. So I'm not going to, but I'd love to talk to you further about it. But where I landed was some of that stuff around acknowledging systemic arrogance and reshaping deference from the global north to the global south. And it's an easy thing to say and a very, very difficult thing to do. But that's the shift, to start deferring to the global south instead of deferring to the global north. Thinking about localisation and diversification as an organisational imperative, again, you would think that might be assumed by a claim, but in practice, not necessarily the case. Anticipating and administering some changes in resource flows and in confederation functions. And one of my favourite things that I would like to explore more is institutionalising rewards and consequences in the global north. So if you do behave in a particular way that's in keeping with these values, then these are your rewards. Then you know that's recognised in the same way as other behaviours are recognised in big international families. If you don't, there are consequences in the same way that if you don't have good financial systems, there are consequences in a big international NGO system. There need to be consequences for not upholding organisational values as well, and some interesting work at CARE and elsewhere trying to do this. And obviously defining a role in the wider system is a big part of that. So a lot of content. I know that was text heavy, but another example of an organisation trying to do things differently. And making some headway, but also identifying that they still had a long way to go. So we have 15 minutes, which was roughly the plan, pardon me, to invite questions from the audience. They can be directed, they can be clarifications to Caitlin or Erin or myself about our own examples, or they might be comments or concerns about the issue, or maybe you just want to use it as a soapbox to talk about your own experience of INGO change or lack of change. Anyone want to kick us off? Got a question up there. I think there's a little roving microphone that's going to have to come to you for the people that are online.
Basically, my question is just directed at all three of you. So, I guess the idea of localization and decolonisation, the end goal, at least theoretically, is that local bodies will be able to help their own people without international organisations have to come in and exert their power and their money to make decisions
I like answering questions, so I'll just answer everything. So I'm just going to shush and step out.
Oh, I was going to say, I think, Glenn, you're probably the person who could speak to that.
Is that me?
Sure, go.
So yeah, that old chestnut of working yourself out of a job. No one's been very good at that so far. Do you know, there's a few things within your question. Firstly, that localisation has an endpoint where there's no role for the North. I'm not sure that is the endpoint. I think to my mind anyway, there was an ODI report a couple of last year that came out that talked about localisation as the journey and locally led development as the end state. And so localisation is about, to my mind, is about those northern organisations fundamentally shuffling and shifting and tweaking their model to, maybe not tweaking, maybe radically overturning. Sorry, Uma, for saying anything about tweaking. But to my mind, I have to believe there's still a role in terms of global citizenship and solidarity and resource sharing, particularly when wealth is so unequally distributed. So I don't think that's the end point is no collaboration. I think the end point is locally led development where power is not held because resources are held. And so I would argue that remains to go. When it comes to the vested interest stuff and like the principle of letting go and the practice of letting go, I think there's still a fair bit of work to do there because there's no doubt that there's a conflict, there's a tension between the sort of part dependence and the growth aspirations of international NGOs and wanting to do more and do differently, and that other aspiration of wanting to have a fundamentally different power relationship and have locally led development as the outcome.
Just a couple of thoughts. Two, I think, and I'd love to hear from Erin on this as well, just from the Oxfam example, that this idea of working yourself out of a job, I mean, certainly that was the case at Oxfam, like they were going on this journey, but actually the organisation was shrinking and people did lose their jobs in that process because they were not taking on the sort of project management responsibilities in one arm of the organisation. But the other thing I was thinking about is the role of advocacy. And I know that not all international NGOs do that work, but that's something that I wrote about. I didn't talk about it today, but my research also looked at that role of advocacy, and I think that could be a greater role that international NGOs could play, because there's so much work to be done here and trying to advocate for changes within policy and that has impacts on a global stage, and we are certainly dealing with problems that are not just local, they're global. So I think that's a really important role, and I look to Erin because obviously she's in the advocacy space as well. So I don't know if you have anything more to add, just some thoughts.
No, I think that concept of localization sort of rings a different bell from the advocacy perspective, where I'm like, oh, what's happening at home? Because there's a lot to be done, and I think that's how I see it as well, in terms of working ourselves out of jobs overseas, perhaps, but shifting our skill set to work generally oriented to justice in the locations that we work from. I think that's sort of, at least personally, what I see the long game as.
Commentary, soapbox.
I have a question. And I'll ask this question.
I think we just have to wait for the microphone, I think. Sorry. Thanks.
There's some people online that can only hear you when you speak to them.
Okay, great. So I'm conscious that we have some institutional donors in the room, but I will ask this question. We've talked a lot, we've heard a lot about NGOs and NGOs, changing structurally, financially, spiritually, in a time of decolonisation. I feel like there, institutional donors, governments, and those bigger funders in the global and the scene and in the region play an important part. I'm just wondering what your perspective is for NGOs working with institutional donors and going on that journey of decolonisation with those bigger power forces?
Does anyone from the audience
want to go first?
No. Everybody's pointing at other people and not answering. Do either of you, while we wait anxiously for our colleagues from MFAT to say something? I've got something.
I mean, only to say that, I don't have expertise or insights into institutional donors either from DFAT or MFAT. I can only speak to Oxfam's experience, though, of trying to push MFAT in certain directions. So I think there's certainly a space for working together on these kind of issues, and I think that is important. That's my only thoughts.
I would, is this in answer to?
Yeah, in answer to that, not in answer, but just a perspective to it is that, and I think the lady in the middle that mentioned that the advocacy role that you play as a global North institution or organization is very important, because that's where. Yeah, it's just in response to that as well. Just the advocacy role that the global North institutions, organizations, INGOs play in advocating for issues is an important role that's been played, and you can't downplay that. And if you are still going to exist in that INGO space, then the advocacy role is important, because development is ultimately about advocacy, practice, and science and research and all of that. So that's an important space to be in and to be able to advocate for those from that angle as well.
Yeah.
Just a comment on that.
Yeah, thanks. My comment was going to be very similar in response to the question. I think that, so I know that in that example I know particularly well, but I also know other examples that of organisations I've been working with over the last couple of years, that the anticipated change from institutional donors, that the assumption that the language around locally led development would translate into fundamentally changed grant windows and models of funding simply hasn't been realised. So it's probably an exception to the rule in the New Zealand aid program, to be honest, especially when we heard the keynote this morning. You won't hear keynotes from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in other nations, other major donor nations, that sound like that one, I would say, at the moment, despite the language of locally led development and self-determination and devolution of power, that many of their own programs have papers and policies on that, but it's not reflected yet in their grant windows or their donor or their grant management practices, or their expectations and their accountability systems and the like. So for all of those organisations that I accompanied on the journey, all of them anticipated in the time that I would be alongside them that institutional donor funds would fundamentally change. They're all emerging middle-income countries, and they expected things to fundamentally change. What resources would be available would probably not come from the institutional donors, and if they did, they'd only go to local organisations. But the reality was not the case. So the role of INGOs in terms of donor funding is fundamentally changed in several of those settings. It actually grew in a time rather than reduced, and did not change in terms of the expectations and processes associated with it. So there's a gap between the aspirations or the values of institutional donors and their practices. So USAID have been really loud in the last year about locally led practice and big policy platforms. They're still doing an awful lot of grant mechanisms that operate exactly the same way, positioning INGOs in the middle, which is a role INGOs like to play and are good at playing, and takes risk off the donors and takes risks off local civil society, but is not all that good at resourcing a fundamental shift in power. So I wanted to land exactly where the speaker up the back said, which is what I think the role there is on donor education and engagement from INGOs, working with their donors about how cooperatively they can fundamentally shift the way their expectations are filtered down through INGO interlocutors, if that makes sense, because I think, and there are some good examples of that. So Red Cross working with the Australian aid program through DFAT, and but also other examples of the world, around the world, where INGOs have engaged with donors and been propositional about doing things differently, potentially even at their own risk and potentially against the wishes of their board with the growth agenda, being propositional and proactive about doing things differently. And that's a great example of the language Caitlin and I both use around institutionalising organisational values over organisational goals or organisational growth. You know, there's a real tension there, but if there's a hierarchy and values sit higher than organisational subsistence or growth or stability or security, then there's space opens up in that conversation for INGOs to be proactive and positive in their engagement with donors and help donors change, because donors are obviously representing constituencies and treasury departments and a whole bunch of others that have very, very specific expectations that are also slow to change. So.
One last question.
Or...
We have one more we have a couple of questions on first one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yep.
Nalini Singh asks, MFATA here, would love to hear more about what other specific things you think we should be doing to really put into practice locally led development and decolonial approaches.
Okay. I think we should land on MFAT by the sound.
Great.
Is the other one similar or is it completely
Maybe
different?
we can take the other one first. Or? Oh, okay.
And there's a third one.
Oh, we might not have time for that.
They just all jumped off in the last like
They've all come running. Are you brave enough, or do we need to just give you a break and say what?
Maybe over a wine later.
Yeah, that's fine.
No recording. Yeah, I understand. Okay, so Nalini, if you're listening, that's a pass.
Yeah.
Sarah, did you want to make a comment?
I'm not in that, but I can speak as observer.
Sure.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks all. I'm an independent consultant who has done some work with them over the last few years. My name is Sarah McKenna, and I think it's really possibly passed many people by the significance of the Reset to Resilience strategy, paragraph 22, which is essentially a call to decolonisation and a commitment to decolonisation. And the paragraph says, we will move away from fly-in, fly-out procurement models of development assistance, and we will find ways to harness cultural expertise and local knowledge. And we will acknowledge that this is a reciprocal arrangement, and it is not just that we are sharing our capability, but we, Aotearoa New Zealand, are also building our capability. And that paragraph, for me as a consultant working with MFAT, is one that I take with me to many interactions. I've seen some really, really positive work within the commercial team at MFAT, which has required, in some senses, dismantling and then rebuilding templates, meeting procedures, procurement evaluation panel sessions to put those words into practice. And it's a long journey. We all know that this takes time and thoughtfulness and authenticity, but I think there is some really good stories and of pockets of change that are happening within the work that we should acknowledge.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yep, we've got another question. Can I?
question actually, it's an example to back up what the
Okay.
other speaker just said, like a small practical example. Thank you. My name's Caroline Novak and I work for Union Aid. We're a small NGO that grew out of the trade union movement, but we also run a series of programs called Young Leaders, which are funded by MFAT. In Southeast Asia, I manage an Indonesian program, and it's in the scheme of the size of development work, they're small projects, small programs, but I think they're very significant because the whole model of the Young Leaders programs is about giving opportunities to young emerging leaders, young development professionals in countries that the programs are in to expand their capabilities and be exposed to different experiences, and I won't go into the detail of the program, but the model is really about that. And the young leaders that come on the program have the opportunity to run and manage a project which is funded through our program, but the control really is completely given to them to work with their communities to design the project informed by their learning through the program and implement that with us, and then in fact in the background as a coaching and mentoring kind of role. So I think it's a great model because it is about, although we manage the program and there is that through tier, we've got INFAT as the funder and the Union Aid as the implementing partner, but we also have implementing partners in our country, in each of our countries. So we work with Bakti in Indonesia as an implementing partner. And through COVID, and plug for our session on Friday, we're going to talk about the example of this in one of the sessions on Friday, but through COVID, INFAT's been really supportive of our mission to shift aspects of our program much more to the Indonesian context. So to create a bigger role for our local partner, to get the young leaders themselves, particularly alumni from our programs, to take on and run aspects of the program, to design aspects of the program. So I just feel that that's a really nice little example in practice at a programmatic level.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that we are out of time, and I feel that we've really underserved the people online. I also note that we misinterpreted the one about MFAT, and it was in fact one of your colleagues. So it's an MFATer. No, rather than MFAT here, which is the way I think we all interpreted it, it's MFAT here. Would love to hear more about what other specific things you think we should be doing, really put into practice. So we put you under enormous pressure and even made somebody else speak on your behalf, and it was our own special ruse. It's a bit like your badge saying independent at the moment. It's a ruse, so I'm sorry we aren't going to, hopefully some of those examples speak to that. There's another from the Fiji Hub about project implementation, where the communities are part of the project planning process or whether they are just receivers of the project. So that's a very specific examples, and I can think of 1,000 examples of where people, Union Aid abroad or Union Aid here as one such example, and a million other examples where the very participatory processes for designing projects. I can also think of a million examples where a project was just planted on a community. So that is a work in progress, I think it's fair to say, across our NGO communities. And the last one is around language, and talks about the fact that many development actors continue to refer to communities as beneficiaries, and subcontracting, their partnerships are limited to subcontracting. These are pain and deficit-oriented models, and it's absolutely the case that there's lots of work being done around language and lexicon. One of those things is the language, the use of beneficiaries. We talked a bit about legacy infrastructure. It's one of those things that slowly but surely we build up language, among other things, that describes what we do, and that is sort of, it changes with time, what is more fashionable or what is more acceptable or what is more desirable at a given point in time. Beneficiaries is one of those examples where it's stuck, and people have actively tried to change that, but it's still not changed everywhere. So I just to acknowledge that speaker, I think from Fiji, and say that we all are part of solving the problem of language, that it perpetuates some of the power imbalances that we purport to want to change.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for giving us this platform.
That was great. Yes. It was cool.